Why is it, Theo, that you focused in on communications as a major area of your professional work and concern?
Well, I'll tell you, that comes out of a long history. My background academically is in management. I would say personally my background is much more psychologically oriented along with more recently feminism, although I suspect I've been a feminist all my life. At least I've been a rebel all my life. But I have been fascinated to see how communication is used as a form of social control, a way of manipulating people, or a way of really connecting with people. The subtleties are infinite and powerful, and many people are not aware of what those dynamics are. And one of the things I see myself doing is surfacing those dynamics so they get visible and easy to see. That's why I like to do a lot of picturing of processes. And also to be able to not only name the games that people play, and we have lots of people who are very good at naming games, but to also get as expert and ingenious in ways of coping with those games, handling them well, particularly so that all the parties involved can gain something of value. I am very strong on the idea of how can we, you, me, others, the organization, the task that's involved and so forth, how can we get it together so that we all gain something of what we want? Maybe it isn't going to be everything, but it moves in the direction that all the parties, including the organization and the job to be done, as if they were persons, increase or move in the directions that are useful, productive, valuable, enhancing. Moving away from the old thing that's so deep in our thinking and our culture and so forth that somebody must win and by definition, therefore, somebody must lose.
And you see communications as an important element in
very
creating those win-win situations.
Absolutely. And I, by the way, prefer to call it gain-gain. I see communications as perhaps, well, certainly among a few primary vehicles by which that's accomplished.
Those were the opening minutes of my interview with Ms. Theo Wells, a communication and management consultant who heads her own firm, Wells Associates, in Beverly Hills, California. She is also a co-author of an award-winning book, Breakthrough: Women into Management. In our conversation, Theo gives us a further understanding of how communications is used as a form of social control and how we can surface and become more aware of the subtle dynamics of communications and methods for how we can use communications as a tool to increase collaboration and problem solving and to strengthen the potential for mutual gain settlements in negotiations. As we continued, Theo indicated the importance of feelings in effective communications. In particular, why being in touch with our feelings is a critical first step in effective communications. What you're saying is that our feelings are an important part or an important element in how effective we communicate with others?
I'm glad you're so perceptive. Absolutely. You know, it always blows my mind when, you know, a lot of the norms in the organizations do suggest that they are hiring your brains and your brawn and forget your gut. Mm-hmm. And I have certainly found it quite difficult to leave my gut at home and take only my brains and my bod to work.
Well, why is it important, though, to be in touch with one's feelings in order to be an effective communicator?
Well, for example, I have observed that most people are rather tentative about asking for a raise. One of the things they almost habitually do is sense the mood of their boss. That's a reality of the workplace. Mm-hmm. It's so obvious it hardly needs saying. But if we really stop to think, about how carefully do we sense what the emotional climate is. What's going on feeling-wise with others that we're going to maybe take a few risks with or something. We're always sensing that feeling climate. However, it doesn't have a lot of validity in the norms of many organizations. After all, we're supposed to keep our cool, we're supposed to, business is business and keep your personal stuff at home, the usual sorts of things that we've come to expect. But the reality is that most people do bring their feelings, their emotions, their beliefs, their attitudes. Attitudes are okay, feelings aren't okay. Have you ever noticed that? Their biases, their assumptions, their stereotypes. We all haul those things around as part of our emotional baggage, so to speak. And to deny their existence is a bit of a lie. And I'm not much on lying. We may as well own it and then take some responsibility for it and do with it what seems appropriate given the environment.
Well, how do people then get comfortable with themselves to such an extent that they can start dealing with their feelings in an organizational setting or in a negotiating situation where they're dealing with individuals from other organizations?
I think that presents an interesting paradox for a lot of people, because there's always a discomfort when you do feel feelings and the environmental norms tell you you're not supposed to feel them. Therefore, it seems to me a lot of this is an inside job. One is, in your head, that the norms out there say, cool it, man, cool it, lady, or whatever. That's fine, but so that's what you do with your exterior. Well, if you want to break that norm, that's always fine to do too, but there may be some risks involved with that. But let's assume for the moment you're not going to break that norm. The rest is what you do on the inside. Many situations arise in interpersonal negotiations, whether it's just between a couple of people in a power negotiation or whether it's a formal situation in a labor union or labor management kind of thing, where anger, for example, may arise, sense of helplessness or frustration, or you suspect somebody is not telling you the whole truth, and there's lots of games that go on in negotiations. The inside job, if we can honor our feelings, if we can honor the existence of our feelings, even though the organizational or the situational norms do not allow their expression, the key thing is that we can honor their existence and therefore know what they are, even if we never communicate any of this outside.
Okay. So you're saying that sometimes it's appropriate to honor these feelings and express them.
No, you didn't hear me right. The key thing is that we honor and recognize them so that we know what we're dealing with within ourselves. That is separate from whether or not it's okay to express them. That's two separate things. Some people think that if you have them, you have to express them. Then that's automatic. To me, I want to separate the having of the feeling and the expressing of the feeling.
Why is it important to do that? Is it sometimes inappropriate to express those feelings?
Well, that's as we were saying. The norms of the situation may say keep your cool and so forth, or you may well know that if you express the feeling, you just blow yourself into the water. But honoring and knowing what they are inside of you, oftentimes that very process is a barometer of what is going on in that situation. It's your sensing gear. It's the stuff that can tell you what the danger signals are, whether or not something is escalating, whether it's beginning to cool a little, whether it looks like somebody is beginning to come around, and maybe you can kind of connect with that tentatively and test it a little bit and so forth. All that sensing kind of thing is available if we can honor that feeling part of ourselves. If we deny it, we've just lost a great piece of sensitive equipment that we all have, if we will honor it.
In addition to our feelings as a sensing device, Ms. Wells stressed the importance of internal rule books we carry with us, and how these rules or assumptions can hinder our effectiveness in communications. Theo describes these rules and assumptions and how they block us from getting the results we want. She also indicates 5 criteria for making a statement of what we want. In other words, how to communicate what we want to another person in a way which will increase the likelihood of getting what we want and setting the stage for constructive problem solving. Theo, what are the conditions which hinder effective communications?
Well, that's one of those huge questions, but one of the things that I am interested in surfacing is what I call our internal rule books. Most of us run around with a lot of rules that we've learned from here, there, somewhere else. Most of them, well, as far as negotiations are concerned, are those things that are very valuable in the work ethic. You know, I've got to follow channels, got to be on time, got to follow orders, got to do what the boss says, don't make waves. A whole collection of good things like that. And one thing I've noticed that most of the time that when we follow the rules, we don't necessarily get what we think we really want. And one of the things that I've sort of been trying to explore is what are some of the kinds of rules that we've learned that somehow get where we're not even conscious that they're rules, assumptions we make, things like that, that sort of get in the way of getting the results we want. And I'm just assuming that anybody who's in the negotiating game is after getting some results they want. But you know, I've noticed quite a variety of things. For example, some people think they shouldn't want anything, and therefore they don't ask for it. Now, some people are so used to thinking about what they don't want that it doesn't occur to them to think about what they do want. Have you noticed that?
Mm-hmm.
Then some people are always looking for somebody else to do something to make it all right. And those people tend to give their power away. You know, it's sort of like, somebody will take care of me, won't they? Those don't usually end up at the negotiating tables, but, you know, they are involved in negotiating their interpersonal relationships as they go along.
Very true, yes.
Then there's some people who go around just gathering advice and trying to find help, and they're asking, what would you do if? And, of course, there's similar type, what do you do when, and they get a lot of advice, but they don't have much criteria on how to use it. Then there's another kind of person I've noticed. They're the ones who are all out for themselves. They're well able to get the results they want until they get stopped short because they stepped on the wrong toes, and they're too busy looking out for number one. Well, then we have another large group. I'll call them almost a cult. And they're the ones who are protecting and justifying the status quo. If they were to even state a result wanted that was any different from what is now going on, they would have to admit that what is going on now is not right. Therefore, they're focused on proving that there isn't any problem at all. But when we're talking about negotiations, most people are very concerned about getting some of the results they want. I'd like to think that most people are concerned about not ripping off the other parties. Not all people are, but many are. And I think it's moving more and more in that direction today. Now, if we want to see how can I, you, and what we're trying to do here, how can we enhance the results, move those towards something that is productive and gainful to you, me, the relationships, other people, and the job and the organization? How do you know that when you see it? How do you even define it? And I've come to this conclusion. I've come to about five criteria as to how to make a statement of what you want so that you increase your odds of getting it. And here are some of the kinds of things that I think in combination work. One is that you state what you do want to have happen when you're finished, and not state what you don't want, or to state what you would like to avoid or to have stopped.
Theo, say that again, please. Are you saying that we should state what we want to see happen and not state what we don't want to see happen?
Yeah. Even to back up one step from that, most people rarely define what result they would like to have when the negotiation processes are over. And I'm suggesting that let's start way back up here at the beginning and state what we would like to have happen, what we'd like the end result to be when we're through the negotiation, and that becomes our target. Now, assuming that, then the first step of that is to state what we do want, not what we don't want. You know, it sort of reminds me of the parent who at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning is pacing the floor and wringing their hands and saying, where in the hell is my goddamn kid? I'm not going to worry about that kid anymore. By God, that kid's old enough to get home on time when they said they're going to. It's 2 hours late. Where in the hell is that? I'm not going to worry about him anymore. And all they're doing is worrying. And every time we say we're not doing something, we are doing what we're saying we're not doing. And what I'm saying is, let us focus on what we do want, which might be, in this case, I'm going to bed and get some sleep. Move towards the action of peacefulness instead, away from what you don't want and toward what you do want, so that the statement that you make of what you want at the end of the negotiation needs to be in terms of what you do want to accomplish.
Why is this important, Theo?
Because you're just more likely to get it if you're focusing your attention on it. It moves all energy in that direction. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that works in the directions you do want instead of in the directions you don't want. And I like those odds. A second kind of thing that helps arrange results in your favor, or my favor, is to assume that you cannot control or change another person. Now, this is a mind-blowing concept to many people, because we just assume, you know, that we can make a dent on somebody's thick skull. But it doesn't really work that way, I've noticed. If you do assume that you can change somebody, in essence, what you're saying to that person, it's like I would say to you, look, if you're really smart, you will change in the way that I tell you to change, and then you'll be more like me, and therefore you will be more right, and then you'll be okay. Hidden in that is a message that says, you're not okay. That's right. And most people really don't dig being told they're not okay. So, therefore, if we make an assumption that you don't give those messages to people, that instead you do assume that you're not going to control them, that you accept them where they are. After all, I do believe even you, along with me, have a right to see the world the way you see it today. That's your life, that's your perception, and I may not agree with it, but by God, I'll fight for your right to see the world the way you see it any old day. And if we can connect on that basis of some kind of mutual regard, even if there is no agreement on some very important issues, we start out with a mutually, or at least I offer you, a bridge for acceptance of you, where you come from, your beliefs, and I help create the climate that you may give me some of that back. Now, you may not, but I do all I can to set up the odds that you may respond in kind.
It's certainly minimizing defensiveness.
That's my ultimate objective, right. because I would like to see us find some way of connecting whereby we can both gain some of what we want. Maybe even all once in a while. Now, a third kind of thing that's involved in getting the results I want, you want, maybe both of us together, would be to focus on what we can control and influence. You know, a lot of people fantasize what they would like to have, but they don't have any ability to control or influence it in any significant way. And therefore, we waste a lot of time, a lot of energy. Wouldn't it be nice if, blah, blah, blah. And all those wouldn't it be nice ifs don't mean anything. If we cannot exercise some kind of control or influence, or if we know someone who is with us, or my particular viewpoint, who does know somebody who can influence or control a situation. If you can't control it, you better move that on either onto somebody else or forget it.
What are some examples of things that we can or cannot control?
Well, for example, I'm thinking of one client I have who is a department in the city system. They're part of a civil service system, which has rules which are extremely difficult to get around, go through, under, over, sideways, or anything else. They've got a routine they have to go through in order to select personnel. They also have an affirmative action plan. They also have an extremely low attrition rate. Now, the people in personnel who are trying to make an affirmative action plan happen, and there are a few that are very sincere in that, their hands are virtually tied because they're in a dilemma situation. They do not and cannot control or even significantly influence either the civil service system, the affirmative action planning group, the rates of attrition, or much anything else that affects the flow of employees in their organization. Their hands are virtually tied. They have a problem, yes, but they cannot deal with the problem because it is a dilemma situation, meaning there are two or more larger systems than themselves in conflict, neither one of those systems of which they can affect in any significant way. Therefore, they are virtually helpless to do much in that situation, and therefore, they better not waste their effort and look for more productive, better odds places to put their efforts to bring about some kind of change.
By not focusing on things that you can't control, you start then directing your energies towards other areas which may offer a more problem-solving or creative approach to the issue under discussion.
Right on. It's sort of the old cost-benefit analysis, or shall we say the effort returns analysis. I want to put my efforts where I'm likely to get some decent returns. Now, another thing that happens with a lot of people, and the reasons they don't get the results they want, they may look for results they want for themselves, but they don't also include their relationships with other people and those other people, and perhaps the task itself. And it seems to me, in most of our negotiating kinds of things, we need to take into account what we want for ourselves, what others want, and what the job and the organization need for enhancement. And therefore, we need to include all those things. And of course, there's a whole underlying theory that every one of those elements can gain something of what they want. When those 5 elements are present, we end up with a statement of results we, all the parties involved, want, where we have set up the odds for maximum achievement.
The 4th element was, Theo?
That we include results wanted for ourselves, for relationships between ourselves and other people and what they want, and the task involved and or the organization.
And the 5th element?
To be sure that everybody, every one of those elements, gains some of what they want.
Theo, what are the reasons that people don't get the results they want in negotiations, even if they meet all the criteria that you just mentioned?
Well, some of the things that get in the way of getting the results we'd like are some of these sort of built-in assumptions, rules, little traps that get in our way sometimes. For example, some people think, if some's good, more's better. Now, in a negotiating situation, some may be just about right, and more could be too much. In other words, like, if some's good, more is better. What for? For what purpose? If you really stop and think about it, I think you might imagine some situations where good is enough and more's too much.
So sometimes over-expectations can inhibit.
Oh, it reminds me a little bit like this thing, if it's bright and shiny and new, it's beautiful. Or if you can buy a medium-sized car, but next year we can buy a big one. But really all I need is how to get to and from work and maybe have a, sort of a jazzy vacation. But beyond that, do I need, however many horsepower is too much? I don't know. But, at 55 miles an hour, how many horse can you use? So if some's good, more's better doesn't get very useful there anymore. It's the same idea in negotiations. Maybe it's smarter, and maybe we get more of what we want if we go after what's good, but don't try to get the last inch every moment. Okay? That's one kind of thing. Another one, I like this one. You know that old saw, if at first you don't succeed, try again?
Yes.
Well, now that's a great one in a negotiation scene, because you could end up beating your head against a good stone wall, one of those hard-headed negotiators. One thing I've noticed that works a little better sometimes is, if at first you don't succeed, do something else. But it's awfully easy to get hung up on some of these old saws that we aren't hardly even conscious of, because, they're sort of, we learned them by osmosis, and now they're in the marrow of our bones, and we rarely get them to mental consciousness. But, it's sort of fun to look at what those are. Let me try another one. Here's a goodie I hear once in a while. Let's tackle the problem and put it to bed once and for all. Now that just sounds nice, like good, nice, tough management. We're going to get the job done. We're going to do it once, and that ends it. Well, that's nifty peachy keen, as long as the nature of the situation lends itself to that particular type of solution. But again, we come back to this dilemma situation. Some problems you could tackle, and you'd find out that you've got a bull by the horns, and they've locked horns. It's really two bulls, not one. Well, that gets into that whole male trip again. Let's change the subject.
All right, but what you're saying there, Theo, is that sometimes problems are not really problems, they're dilemmas that cannot be solved.
That's right.
And that it's better to back off from those dilemmas?
I don't think it's very good use of energy to try to solve dilemmas when you only have the capability of solving solvable problems, which you can define. And a dilemma is 2 or 3 steps away from that.
But aren't all negotiations dilemmas?
No. I don't agree with that at all. I think negotiations, the only reason that negotiations are possible is because there are areas that are open to varying views, which people can, who do have some power to influence, and arrive at some kind of coming together. If it's a dilemma, that open negotiating space does not exist. There's another one I rather like that does hang up people. If it can be done, it should be done. In a negotiating situation, that could be pretty deadly sometimes. Because, you know, you might know that you can lay low your opponent, or who seems like an opponent at that point. If you do, you know, there may be a whole series of negative consequences. And yet that whole idea that if it can be done, it should be done, is rather pervasive at a very subtle level. For example, if we can get to the moon, we should get to the moon. And, you know, most negotiations aren't moonshots, and yet there's a subtle thing that kind of goes, well, if I can do it, let's do it. These are subtle sorts of things, but I think it helps to get aware of them. Another one is, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing first. You know, another moonshot comparison is quite possible. You know, we have to get there before the Russians do. But there's some things, you know, that's sort of the competitive model. The question is it worth doing for what we would like to achieve in this situation? Mm-hmm. And the answers may be somewhat different.
These trap stands are some patterns of traditional patterns of the way that we approach negotiations, which we have to be careful of, because they inhibit creativity, they inhibit problem solving, they inhibit mutuality.
I'd like to just interject there. I'm not sure that they're even traditional approaches to negotiations. To me, they're sort of some of the subtle kinds of things that we may not even think about when we're thinking about negotiating, that are like stuff we learn at mother's knee, or, you know, it's the whole Horatio Alger story, or it's good old Ben Franklin, and some of the others of our venerated souls, who have made some very significant and valuable contributions through time. But for what, when, to accomplish what objectives that are mutually gainful to all the parties involved. What some of these things are may not apply in every situation, and I think we need to be selective in what kinds of norms, rules, values, assumptions, and so forth that we make, so that we select those things which will enhance the goals, however diverse they may be, for what's going on in this one given situation. And I suppose what I'd really like to conclude with, we should also ask the question, a question that is available for us to ask is, could we draw the circle a little bit bigger so that we could include diverse and sometimes disagreeing viewpoints, so that in the larger context, further agreement was potentially possible?
We'll return to the interview with Theo on the reverse side of this cassette, in which he describes methods and skills we can use to limit our defensiveness in negotiations as one more step to building a collaborative climate between negotiators. At this point, however, let's examine some additional steps we can take to avoid creating defensiveness in those with whom we're negotiating. And to do this, I'll cover a series of guidelines which should be generally followed in our reactions to the behavior, actions, or communications we get from the people on the other side of the table. First, a critical rule in minimizing communications which create defensiveness is to use descriptive rather than judgmental language. Descriptive language is more likely to encourage openness and trust between people, rather than generating anger or defensiveness. As an example, consider these two statements. First, you are wrong, and second, I disagree with you. Now, the second statement is less likely to create defensiveness because in this case, I'm assuming responsibility and ownership for my opinion. In the first instance, when I say you're wrong, I'm in a sense attacking that person directly and attributing a defect in his reasoning ability. I'm evaluating him as being good or bad, right or wrong. Another consideration in using this guideline is to focus on describing our observation of the action or behavior of the other negotiator and owning up to our own feelings rather than judging the other person's intentions. For example, if I'm dealing with an opposing negotiator and all his body language is defensive and hostile, one reaction on my part could be to say, "Hey, knock off being angry with me." But in doing that, I'm interpreting his intentions. And since his intentions are his own business and known only to himself, interpreting his behavior might cause him to react with anger because, in a sense, I'm attacking his motives. A more constructive approach would be to describe my observation of his behavior to him. I see you frowning, your hands are clenched, and your legs are crossed, and at this point, I'm feeling threatened. In this case, I'm focusing on what I can see or hear in someone's behavior, not my assumptions of his intentions. This type of statement is more conducive to reducing his defensiveness and also allows him to more freely describe whether, in fact, he's really angry at me. Another guideline in reacting to someone's behavior or opinion is to focus our reactions on the specific behaviors or actions of the other person. The more specific we are in our communication, the more likely the receiver can pinpoint what is of real concern to us. The more general we are, the more likely our reaction will be seen as a criticism to his entire being, his entire personality, and not to one specific action on his part. An example of a communication following this guideline would be, "When you said X, Y, and Z, I felt angry," rather than, "You're a constant pain in the neck." A final guideline for minimizing the chances of getting someone on the defensive is to share our reactions as soon after the event as possible, because at that point the event is still fresh in everyone's mind. However, we also have to consider that it might be appropriate to delay communicating our reactions if, for example, the reactions might best be given in private, or if we need more time to check out some facts or to clarify our own emotions. Let me summarize these guidelines for communicating effectively and for reducing the likelihood of creating anger or defensiveness in others. The first guideline: be descriptive rather than judgmental. Second, base and state your reactions on observable actions rather than your assumptions or interpretations. Third, focus your reactions on specific incidents rather than generalities. And fourth, give your reactions and feedback as soon after the event as possible. One modification to these guidelines: sometimes we do have to make evaluative judgments. We do have to evaluate what's good or bad, effective or ineffective. These types of evaluations are a constant and necessary part of our lives. So that raises the question of how we can communicate these evaluative reactions and judgments and still minimize the threat to the receiver. Essentially, the best way of handling these kinds of situations is to communicate these judgments in comparison with standards or measures, and as a result increase the objectivity of our judgments. If we, for example, have to evaluate a subordinate, one basis for our judgment would be to compare his performance with the performance of other employees doing the same type of job. Another basis for comparison would be some commonly accepted standard of performance. For example, a conflict over a performance contract or in settling a wage rate dispute. Commonly accepted standards could be the basis for reasonable reactions to another negotiator's position or proposal. A third basis for making judgments more objective is to base them in comparison with a standard of performance previously established between the two negotiators. A judgment using this type of standard would be, based upon our agreement on a range for settling on a price for this car, your last offer far exceeds the highest point on that range. Again, in each of these cases, the major guideline is to temper evaluative judgments by basing them on some commonly accepted standard of performance or a comparative measure, rather than criticizing the intent or performance of the other party on a wholly subjective basis.